I'm Madison. I'm standing outside the fancy restaurant, the cool night air brushing against my face. The weight of what just happened inside still lingers, but there's also a strange sense of lightness, like a burden has been lifted. Just a short while ago, I was sitting at that long table with my family, watching my father give his usual speech about the hard years and how the family always pulls through. It was the same story he'd been telling for years, but this time, I knew the truth. And I was ready to expose it. As he lifted his glass and said, "Things have been tight, but with each other, we always pull through," I felt a surge of anger and determination. I set down my napkin, reached into my bag, and stood up. I started by saying I wanted to talk about those years we pulled through, and then I began laying out the evidence on the white tablecloth. I told them that for 8 years, I'd sent my parents $3,000 every month because I'd been told their business had collapsed and they were drowning in medical debt. But the truth was, their business had recovered 6 years ago and was thriving. There was no medical debt on record, and 2 years ago, they'd bought a vacation condo in cash. I pointed to the spreadsheet with the total of $288,000 at the bottom and said, "This is what it cost me, the house I didn't buy, the vacations I never took." The table went silent. My father's face turned white, then red. He exploded, calling me ungrateful and saying I was making a scene. But I just let him rant because I knew the evidence spoke for itself. My sister, Lily, went pale, realizing that her accidental photo had been the catalyst for all of this. My brother Ethan stared at his plate, and my mother started to cry, reaching for the old lullaby she'd used to manipulate me for so long. But this time, it didn't work. I looked at her and said, "You're right, Mom. I was the only one you could count on. You just made sure I was also the only one who paid." And then, in the end, my mother admitted that it had been real at the beginning, but then things got better and they didn't know how to stop taking my money. I drew the line, telling them the monthly payments were over, and I wouldn't be pursuing them in court. I just wanted them to know the truth. I paid for my own meal and walked out, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces. Now, as I stand here, I can't help but think about how it all started. 8 years ago, I was in my early 30s, a successful forensic accountant. My parents, Richard and Grace, had always been loving, but one day, my father called me with a shaky voice. He said his business in the manufacturing industry had collapsed because a major client had gone bankrupt. He sent me the layoff paperwork, and my heart broke for him. Then my mother got on the phone, crying about the medical bills and the debt they were facing. They didn't directly ask for money, but I could tell they were in desperate need. I offered to send them $3,000 a month until they got back on their feet. My father protested, but I could tell he was relieved. My mother wept and said I was a godsend. I set up an automatic transfer that week and never thought twice about it. I rearranged my life to make it work. I stopped saving for a house, skipped vacations, and took on extra work to cover the monthly payments. I believed I was doing the right thing, holding my family together. But looking back, there were signs. I offered to help them with their finances a few times, but my mother always brushed me off. She said I was too busy and that they didn't want to be a burden. Once, I offered to call the hospital to negotiate the medical debt, and she got flustered and said it was handled. I let it go, thinking I was just being overprotective. Then, one night, a little after 10, I received a text from Lily. There was no message, just a photo. It was a birthday dinner for my father at a high-end restaurant where a single plate cost $500. He was surrounded by the family, laughing, with a huge cake in front of him. And behind his elbow was a receipt and a credit card. I zoomed in on the receipt. The numbers were staggering, a dinner total that was more than my monthly mortgage. And then I saw the credit card. It was a black card with my father's name on it, the kind banks only give to wealthy people. I remembered a phone call just 2 weeks earlier when my father had sighed and said, "Things are still tight, sweetheart." That was the moment everything changed. I couldn't sleep that night. I decided to do what I do best, investigate. I started with my own bank statements, pulling 8 years of transfers to my parents. I built a spreadsheet and watched as the total climbed. It was a cold, hard number, $288,000. I then turned to public records. I found that my father's company had recovered after a rough year and had been profitable for the past 6 years. There was no medical debt, and the vacation condo they'd bought 2 years ago was paid for in cash. I also discovered that I'd been left out of the family group chat for years. I asked Lily to add me, and she said she thought I was already in it. It was clear that they'd been keeping me in the dark, taking my money while living a life of luxury. I needed a human source to confirm my findings, so I called my aunt, Rose. She told me all about my father's birthday dinner and how he'd been bragging about how comfortable they were. She was shocked to learn that I was still sending them money. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence. I hesitated, thinking about the love I'd had for my parents. But I knew I couldn't let the lie continue. I printed the spreadsheet and put it in a folder with all the other documents. I learned that there was going to be another big dinner for my father's 65th birthday. My mother called to invite me, probably because the money was late that month. I said yes, but not in the way she thought. In the 2 weeks leading up to the dinner, I prepared my evidence. I made copies, wrote a summary page, and practiced what I would say. I turned off the automatic transfer, and it only took a few days for my parents to notice. My father called, fishing for an explanation, but I just told him I was reviewing my finances. My mother called 2 days later, trying to guilt-trip me by talking about my father's health. But while she was talking, I was looking at old photos of the restaurant on social media. I saw that the birthday dinners were a tradition, and I'd been missing out on them for years. Ethan texted me a few days before the party, telling me not to upset our parents. But I knew he was in on it. I played dumb and told him I was looking forward to the celebration. The night before I flew home, I reviewed the final folder one last time. I felt a sense of calm. I knew I was doing the right thing. Now, as I stand here on the sidewalk, Aunt Rose catches up to me. She takes my hand and says she's sorry. She says I did the right thing. And for the first time in 8 years, I feel free. The $3,000 a month that used to go to my parents now stays in my account. I've bought the house I always wanted, and I take vacations without feeling guilty. My father hasn't called me, and my mother's calls have become more honest. Lily sent me an apology, but I'm not sure she fully understands. Ethan has said nothing. The extended family knows the truth, and my father's reputation as the generous patriarch has crumbled. I don't feel triumphant, but I do feel like I've finally taken control of my life. $288,000 bought me a very expensive lesson, but I consider it the best money I've ever spent. If you've ever sacrificed for someone who was lying to you, take this as a sign to check the math. Love freely, but keep your eyes open.